Your heart is hammering against your ribs, palms so sweaty you can barely grip your notes. You are terrified. But that arrogant person across the room? Completely chill, effortlessly calm. Science confirms it. Certain highly arrogant individuals handle make-or-break moments better than everyone else. Their secret? A mental armor built on 4 psychological pillars. But here is what nobody tells you. Hook that same person to a medical monitor, and their blood tells a totally different story than their calm face. In escape rooms, they do not solve puzzles faster. They just steal the final move. And the moment nobody is watching, their superpower vanishes completely. They are like solar-powered toys, but instead of the sun, they run entirely on applause. Today, I will show you exactly how their mind works under pressure, why their biological shield is secretly cracking, and most importantly, how you can steal their mental armor without adopting a single toxic trait. Let us break it down. To figure out why this happens, we will look at fascinating behavioral research and clinical data. I will break down exactly what happens inside a highly arrogant brain during a crisis. And most importantly, I will outline how you can steal their mental armor without adopting their toxic personality. We will even look at what medical monitors reveal about their biology and how it tells a totally different story than their calm faces. But let us look at this mental armor first. We need to move past that fuzzy gym teacher cliche of mental toughness and look at what it is actually made of. Researchers break mental toughness down into 4 concrete psychological parts. They call them the 4 C's. The first C is control. This is the core belief that you are driving your own car. You are not just a passenger in your own life. When a crisis hits, you do not think, why is this happening to me? You immediately think, I can handle this. I can change the outcome. It's an active mindset rather than a passive one. If control is about driving the car, the next piece is about staying on the road when the drive gets totally miserable. That is the second C, which is commitment. It's the difference between downloading a language app because the gamification is super fun for the first 3 days, but then actually sitting down to memorize vocabulary 6 months later when the novelty is completely gone and it just feels like work. Commitment is the unglamorous long game. Looking at how arrogant people behave, the next piece has to do with how they view obstacles. These people never seem to think anything is actually hard. That brings us to the third C, which is challenge. This one is all about how your brain's alarm system reads danger, how you perceive the threat. Do you see a difficult test as a giant wall blocking your path, or do you see it as a hurdle that you can jump right over? If you view a threat as a challenge, it completely changes how you physically experience pressure. Your blood vessels actually dilate instead of constricting, preparing you for action rather than freezing up. So we have control, commitment, and challenge. The final piece is the most obvious one, given the personality type we are talking about. It is confidence. Confidence is that deep, unshakable belief in your own worth and skills, even if you completely fail at something. What is truly fascinating in the psychological data is that out of all 4 C's, confidence is the main engine keeping highly arrogant people calm. It acts like a filter. Think of it as a video game shield. They are constantly running this background script in their head saying, I am vastly superior to everyone in this room. So the stress just bounces right off them. Deep down, they literally do not believe they can fail. That inflated view of themselves lines up with the concepts of confidence and control. It creates a real, tangible mental buffer against anxiety. But we need to slow down and be incredibly careful here. That shield is highly conditional. This video game shield does not protect every boastful kid in your class or every loudmouth at the office. We have to split the stereotype in half. Not every person who talks a big game is actually bulletproof. A crucial caveat. We are talking about everyday arrogance here. We are not talking about the serious medical diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. That is a complex clinical condition with its own serious struggles. We are only looking at everyday arrogance in normal functioning people. The coworker who always talks over everyone in a meeting, or the classmate who constantly name drops to sound important. Science divides that everyday arrogance into 2 entirely different categories. The first is the grandiose type. These are the dominant, status-obsessed people who actually believe their own hype. The outside totally matches the inside. The video game shield works perfectly for them. But the second type is where it gets complicated. The vulnerable type. To anyone watching, they might seem just as self-absorbed and demanding, but inside, their minds operate in a completely different reality. They are deeply fragile. They are constantly on edge, hypersensitive to even the tiniest bit of criticism. Their arrogance is not coming from overflowing self-belief. It is a frantic, desperate need for other people to validate them, just to keep their bruised ego from falling apart. Their shield is not just glitchy, it does not even exist. They are walking onto the battlefield completely exposed, just hoping nobody notices. The data shows they actually have terrible sleep quality and way higher baseline stress, and when pressure hits, they do not rise to the moment. They spiral downward because they simply do not have the control or the confidence engine to keep them steady. This totally changes the way you look at people in your daily life. That coworker who is always fishing for compliments. You never actually know which type they are. You are usually just looking at a mask. They might be a grandiose type who genuinely feels no stress, or they might be frantically covering up a massive internal panic attack. It is almost always a mask with the vulnerable type. But let us bring our focus back to the grandiose type, the ones with the working shield. It makes sense that their shield works when they are bragging at a party, but that confidence has to crack eventually. What happens when they are forced to actually perform? What triggers that mental armour to turn on in the first place? This brings us to the glitch we mentioned earlier. The armour only activates and they only outperform everyone else when there is a chance for glory. Glory meaning high visibility, like an audience, the spotlight. Let us look at sports psychology to see this in action. If you take a highly arrogant, grandiose athlete and put them in a boring practice session on a rainy Tuesday with no cameras and no crowd, they tank. Their performance is completely average. Actually, they often perform significantly worse than their teammates because they lack any intrinsic inner drive. There is no glory on a rainy Tuesday. Nobody is watching them run drills. Their brain literally calculates that there is no point in trying hard if nobody is there to witness their greatness. But put that exact same athlete in a championship final with TV cameras broadcasting to millions and a stadium full of screaming fans, and they flip a switch. Their performance shoots through the roof. They throw with more precision. They land complex routines flawlessly. If we connect this to everyday life, they are essentially like solar-powered toys. But instead of the sun, they run entirely on applause. If you remove the attention, the machine just shuts down entirely, which perfectly explains the absolute agony of group projects. Researchers call it social loafing. It is that person who talks a massive game during the initial brainstorming session, promising they are going to revolutionize the whole project. They have all the big ideas. But when it is time to quietly format the spreadsheet or do the boring, tedious background research, they pull a total vanishing act. Because if the task structure prevents them from getting individual personal credit, their brain decides the effort is utterly wasted. Why expend precious energy if your name is not going to be at the top of the page in bold letters? But the instant the manager walks in and asks who solved a specific problem, they suddenly leap into action, acting like the hardest worker in the room. It is infuriating to watch. This addiction to glory brings us to how they handle choking. Choking is when you mess up something you normally know how to do flawlessly just because people are watching, like parallel parking on a busy street. When you suddenly realize people on the sidewalk have stopped to stare at you and you just forget how to use a steering wheel. Your brain suddenly tries to manually control a physical habit you already know how to do automatically. You overthink the mechanics, anxiety floods your working memory, and you completely mess up the task. Their immunity to choking goes against everything we know about performance anxiety. I always assumed a friendly crowd would help you perform better, but the data shows that having a supportive audience, like your family sitting in the front row, actually makes normal people more likely to choke. The fear of disappointing your loved ones spikes your anxiety even higher. The emotional stakes flood your system. Normal people become hyper-aware of being judged. They care deeply about social bonds and expectations. But the grandiose types do not. They operate in reverse. They are practically immune to choking because they do not fear letting anyone down. They do not care about other people's expectations. To them, the audience is not a panel of judges scoring their worth or finding their flaws. The audience is just a mirror reflecting their own brilliance back at them. The audience is not a threat, it is pure fuel. So far we've been trusting their sports stats and what they check off on psychological surveys, but highly arrogant people are basically world-class liars. They are defined by their ability to manage impressions and make themselves look good at all costs. So what happens if we stop trusting their words? What if we bypass the surveys, hook them up to medical monitors and force their biology to tell the truth? This is where the story gets incredibly messy. To measure physical stress in a clinical setting, researchers track a hormone called cortisol. Think of cortisol as your body's fire alarm. When your brain senses danger, the amygdala sounds the alarm and floods your bloodstream with cortisol to get you ready to fight or run away. It raises your heart rate, pumps glucose into your muscles, all that survival stuff. So the theory is, if they are truly as fearless and relaxed as they claim, their fire alarm should stay totally silent even under immense pressure. So what do the lab tests show? In several careful lab tests, that is exactly what happens. Researchers for them to give a surprise math speech to a panel of bored hyperjudgmental evaluators in white lab coats, a total nightmare scenario for most people. But the grandiose person shows what is called blunted reactivity. Their cortisol levels barely move. Their biological shield holds up perfectly. But there is a massive however. Other strict studies, especially ones focusing on male participants, reveal a violently different biological reality, a contradiction in the data. In these specific tests, the grandiose person is doing the highly stressful task. Looking totally calm on the outside, they are confidently telling the researchers they feel zero anxiety and have everything completely under control. But their blood samples show their cortisol levels are absolutely spiking through the roof. If their blood is practically radioactive with cortisol, they are not actually handling the pressure at all. They are just lying to you. They are secretly panicking on a chemical level. It is severe cognitive dissonance. When you combine the inner architecture of grandiose arrogance with heavy societal pressure, especially demanding masculine dominance and invulnerability, the mental load becomes enormous. Let me break down the biology of what is actually happening there. The deepest, most primitive part of their brain is terrified. It is pumping out cortisol, screaming danger to run away. But their conscious ego, the part that manages their self-image, is clamping down, insisting, I must look perfect. I cannot show weakness. It is an internal war. Fighting your own fight or flight response drains your glucose. It exhausts your mental bandwidth. That is physically exhausting. And you can see how this faking plays out when the mistakes are real and not just in a pristine laboratory setting. Let us look at the behavioural studies conducted inside escape rooms. An escape room is the ultimate real-world pressure cooker. You are trapped in a small room. The clock is ticking down from 60 minutes. It instantly reveals how people work together under stress. Behavioural experts watch grandiose types try to solve these rooms with a team, and they found a glaring pattern. They do not actually solve puzzles faster or better than anyone else. If they are not solving the puzzles, what are they actually doing in there for an hour? They optimise their behaviour to look like the leader. They will loudly direct someone else to do a very simple task. Or they will physically step in to claim the final move on a combination lock that someone else just spent 10 minutes figuring out. They are managing how sex looks, not doing the actual work of succeeding. They dig into the performance, not the puzzle. But what happens if they fail? If the clock hits 0 and they cannot solve the room, how does their brain handle the fact that they are supposed to be superior, but they just lost? They fix that mental conflict through a psychological defense mechanism called devaluation. If they fail, their ego protects itself by instantly shifting blame to the environment. And instead of admitting they struggled, they convince themselves the puzzle was inherently flawed. the escape room was poorly designed, or their teammates were totally incompetent. They protect their fragile ego by trashing the very thing that challenged them. The test was not hard. The test was stupid. It is a perfect self-preservation loop. So if their confidence is largely this exhausting biological illusion, and their teamwork is just a series of optical tricks, why do human beings keep putting these people in charge of companies or countries? It really comes down to an evolutionary bug in human psychology. In terrifying, confusing times, a highly arrogant person's absolute certainty looks exactly like competence to a frightened brain. When things get scary, we just want someone who does not show any doubt. They speak in absolutes, they act like decisive protectors, and the group naturally moves toward that feeling of safety. But the data shows the actual skill rarely backs it up. They do not produce steadily better results for their organizations. What they produce is extreme volatility because they are constantly hunting for glory. Think of it like a basketball player who refuses to take easy layups and only shoots from half court. And that half court shot somehow goes in, the crowd goes wild, the highlight reel plays on loop, and they look like a visionary hero. But the actual math of the game means that most of the time they are just recklessly throwing the ball away and costing the team the game. That analogy captures the risk they pose to any group. They might score a spectacular win, but they are equally likely to trigger a catastrophic or organization-destroying failure. And what happens over time? The research proves that eventually the illusion always breaks down. The shine fades. The people around them figure out the act, the credit stealing, the slacking on the boring tasks, the constant trashing of others to protect their own ego. Long-term tracking shows that their social capital eventually deteriorates. It slowly destroys trust, and then the faking catches up to them too. Because adult life and most leadership jobs involve chronic low-glory stress. It is grinding through boring supply chain issues or managing minor arguments on a random Tuesday morning. There is no crowd cheering when you balance a budget spreadsheet. Without that outside applause to fuel their inner engine, the constant low-level pressure starts to break them. Under chronic job stress, their emotional reactions actually get worse compared to everyone else. Their mental advantage is basically rented, not owned. They extract flashy short-term benefits by using other people's attention, but the long-term costs are paid by everyone else, and eventually the bill comes due for them too. So we have mapped their fragile machinery. We understand the biological glitches and the evolutionary bugs. Now, the ultimate question: how do we extract the superpower and leave the toxic poison behind? How do you steal that mental armour? It comes right back to those 4 C's: control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. You do not need a grandiose, delusional view of your own superiority to practice these traits. You build your shield out of stronger materials. For example, you build your confidence on actual preparation, not a delusion of grandeur. Let us make this practical. Let us say you are giving a massive presentation to your company's board of directors. You are terrified. How do you replicate that video game shield without being toxic? You start by actively reframing your physical response. When you stand up in that boardroom and your heart starts hammering against your ribs, your default reaction is to think, oh no, I'm panicking. I am failing, which just makes you panic more. You need to consciously tell your brain a different story. You remind yourself that your racing heart is just your body flooding your system with focus juice. It is pumping glucose to your muscles and oxygen into your brain to help you jump the hurdle. You turn the cortisol from a panic alarm into a performance enhancer. Then you lean into the control and commitment parts. You remind yourself of the grueling hours you spent researching the numbers when nobody was cheering for you. You anchor your confidence in the reality of your hard work. So you deploy the armour when the stakes are highest, just like the grandiose person. But the key difference is you also have the inner drive to do the unglamorous work on a rainy Tuesday. True mental toughness, like doing that unglamorous work without an audience, actually requires far less biological energy than the exhausting cognitive dissonance of the arrogant person's fake mask. Because you are not constantly fighting your own biology just to keep up appearances. Your brain and your body are actually working together as a team. You get to keep the mental toughness because you actually own it. You're not just renting it with other people's attention, and you avoid the toxic traps entirely. You do not have to devalue your co-workers or blame the room when things go wrong, because your ego is not tied to a fragile illusion of perfection. It is a much healthier, much more sustainable way to handle pressure. This entire analysis has been incredibly eye-opening. We have looked into the surprisingly fragile, biologically complex world of the stress-proof ego, and hopefully you have picked up a few pieces of mental armour to build for yourself. But let us end with a final provocative thought. If an arrogant person only brings their absolute best effort when someone is watching, take a hard look at your own daily life. How much of your best work is truly driven by a genuine inner desire to grow? And how much of it is just you running on applause? It is a tough question to answer. So the next time you find yourself at that metaphorical free throw line or stepping up to that boardroom presentation, make sure you are taking the shot for yourself.